Hello and welcome to another episode of the Finrestra podcast. I am Jan Muschot. In this episode, I'll be talking about greenwashing by banks. So, greenwashing is a way of presenting information about your company in a way that makes it seem more environmentally friendly than it really is. And by doing a lot of research recently on banks and climate change, I noticed at least 9 patterns of banks that are greenwashing their contribution. So let's just get started at number 1. They focus on their own operations. When people are talking about the impact of banks on climate change, what they actually mean is that banks enable the operations of fossil fuel companies and other emitters of greenhouse gases. And this is reflected in the loan portfolio of banks. So they have billions of euros worth of loans on the asset side of their balance sheet. But banks try to divert attention away from this big contribution to climate change to their own very small contribution. So obviously, to be a bank, you don't need a lot of resources. You just need to heat some offices and your workers need to commute to the office. But your own emissions are quite low. And then if you focused on the fact that, oh yeah, our bank buys 100% renewable electricity, for example, or we've reduced the use of paper or the emission of our own greenhouse gases because we moved to a new building that's better insulated. That's not what most people talk about about the impact of banks on climate change. The second way of greenwashing is simply to join a club. So at COP26 in Glasgow at the Climate Summit, a lot of banks stress the fact that they are part of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which we discussed in a previous episode. And even central banks, they have their own club, the Network for Greening the Financial System. And of course, if you're with a lot of competitors, it's easy to seem green because everybody will follow the same or similar disclosures and targets for the long run, but you're not very ambitious just by joining a club. So I consider this also a method of greenwashing. A third way of greenwashing is to hype trivial improvements. Again, without talking about specific banks, I can tell you about some examples of these trivial improvements. So there's a bank that says that by 2030, it will stop doing business with oil and gas companies. But then if you look at their financial statements, you notice that oil and gas are really a very insignificant part of their business because they mostly work with retail clients and SMEs. Or another bank that said, oh yeah, by 2025, we want to increase the amount of funding that goes to renewable energy to 65% of the lending that goes to power companies. And then you see that already now they're doing 61% of that lending to renewable energy. So this is really a very, very small or minimal ambition to have. And then it's very easy to report in a couple of years' time, oh yeah, we made it or we did these improvements, but in fact these improvements are very small. The fourth way to greenwash your loan portfolio is to minimize the dirty numbers. So instead of looking at every loan related to fossil fuel cars, for example, you only report numbers on exposure to oil and gas companies. But of course, from the moment that oil and gas come out of the ground until they are burned at the end consumer, there's such a large part of the economy, which includes the transportation, the refineries, then you have the car dealers, the car manufacturers, the repair shops, the retail client that gets a car loan. So instead of taking into account this entire industry, you only look at, for example, the oil and gas companies that drill the fossil fuels out of the ground or that pump them out of the ground. So that's a kind of greenwashing. And then you can easily say like, oh yeah, this is just, for example, 2% of our total loan portfolio because you limit your reporting to just the oil and gas companies. The opposite of number 4 is, of course, to inflate your green numbers. So if you want to make it seem that you're doing a lot for sustainable activities like renewable energy, what you're going to do, instead of report your numbers for a single year, you're going to report them for 10 years. So you'll say, oh yeah, we have this target that from here on until 2030, we'll invest 100 billion euros in renewable energy. But of course, if you would chop it up into single years, then it would only be like 10 or 11 billion per year, which is much lower. The sixth way of greenwashing is what I call triple counting the investments in stuff like renewable energy. So if you have, for example, a utility company that wants to generate electricity with wind turbines at sea, then they make, for example, a 1 billion euro investment in real physical capital. This is funded, for example, with 1 billion euro worth of bonds that are bought by, for example, a pension fund. So now we have 1 billion euro in the real world, 1 billion euro in the books of the pension fund. But to get the bonds from the utility company to the investor, so to the pension fund, you'll need an investment bank. And that investment bank itself could say, oh yeah, we financed 1 billion euro worth of renewable energy. But of course, while strictly speaking, they're not lying, it's very misleading. And it's already been booked once in the real world, once at the pension fund. And then the investment bank will triple count it by also mentioning it in its financing activities. The seventh way of greenwashing is by cherry picking the benchmark. So I think everybody who listens to this podcast is very well aware that you can always make investments seem better in hindsight by comparing them to a benchmark that performed worse. And you can also do it about climate change. So one blatant example that I noticed was a bank that's mainly active in Europe that compared its loan portfolio for electricity generation to electricity generation worldwide. But of course, in Europe, most energy is generated by nuclear power plants and by burning gas, which is less polluting than by burning coal. But in other companies around the world, and especially in China, they still burn a lot of coal. So obviously, by looking at the world instead of just the geography where you are working as a bank, then it's very easy to make it appear that you're greener than you really are. The eighth way of greenwashing that I noticed is by referring to awards. But it's actually quite easy for big banks to win awards because they have these organizations that give these awards to themselves. So the awards never look at all of the banks, including ethical and sustainable banks that are active, but they are limited to maybe like 100 or maybe just 50 big banks. And then, of course, if you have multiple categories, it's easy to perform well in at least one. And this is something that's very relevant also for NGOs that make rankings of banks. You're just actually giving ammunition to the big banks to greenwash. Because I noticed that some NGOs look at debt capital markets, for example, while the others look at loan portfolios or even just disclosures of banks. Then even dirty banks will be able to pick, like, for example, the 8 ranking, because there they are a top 10% bank, while in other rankings they could score very low. This is not a theoretical example, but again, I don't want to name names, but you definitely see that some banks are labeled as climate leaders by one NGO, and then the other NGO said, oh yeah, this is really a dirty bank, and they're talking about the same institutions. So this is really, not what they had hoped for, I guess. And then finally, the ninth method of greenwashing is what I call piggybacking. So instead of the banks being the drivers towards a more green economy, where they really grab their clients and almost force them to become more green, they are more passive actors, the banks. So, and they will provide credit if their clients, like just retail clients or corporates, they want to invest in greener alternatives like more efficient production processes, or if they want to renovate their house, or if they want to buy a battery electric vehicle instead of a fossil fuel car. This way banks will become greener over time, but that's just because economies of scale and innovation, and because it's mandated by, for example, the European Union. But it's not because the banks actively force their clients into becoming more green. So, and in a sense, this is normal because the bank cannot become too, or the bank cannot lower its interest rate on loans too much, because otherwise it will just go bankrupt, because it's not going to be profitable anymore. So these were the 9 ways in which I noticed that banks are greenwashing and misleading investors and the public about their impact on climate change. So to sum it up, we had focus on your own operation, not on the balance sheet. Join a club of banks that declare that they want to do something for climate change. Number 3 was hype trivial improvements. 4, minimize the dirty numbers. 5, inflate your green numbers. 6 was triple counting. 7, cherry picking the benchmark. 8 were awards for climate change and banks. And then 9, of course, was the piggybacking on the real economy. So once again, this is not really a complaint about banks. This is just some greenwashing that I see in real life and that you can see in a lot of reports. If you find any other examples, I would be very pleased to hear about them. If you're on Twitter, you can follow me at Jan Muschoot. That's at JANMUSSCHOOT. If you have any other questions also about our courses and our custom research that we do, you can mail me at jan.muschoot@finrestra.com. So that's JAN.MUSSCHOOT@FINRESTRA.com. And this is the end of the Finrestra podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and till next time.